The Voice. So some clever chap or woman pursued a Freedom of Information request to get the actual Uluru Statement from the heart. It's 26 pages. The Freedom of Information delivered 112 pages in total. This video looks at the first 86 pages, which summarise 12 dialogue conferences held in 12 different parts of Australia back in 2016 and 2017. It's important to understand these dialogues because they show the original intentions, aims, sentiment, suggestions and goals that were boiled down to write the non-public 26-page Uluru Statement, which was then boiled down again to get to a public one-page statement. Surprisingly, the goal for a black parliament paid for by reparations made it into the actual 26-page document, but not into the one-pager. So let's begin. Fact-checkers, you are more than welcome to look through the document yourselves. You will find nothing I'm saying here is not true. At the 12 dialogues held across Australia, legitimate issues were discussed, such as improving employment, business opportunities, education, health issues, violence and abuse issues, and such. All good stuff that Australians can get on board with, but no detail into how all these complex issues that have been around for a long time would somehow finally be fixed by anything in the documents. There was one great suggestion, though, about less government bureaucracy and red tape. So there were common themes, suggestions, and demands across the 12 dialogues. Each conference started by remembering their continued struggle, massacres, stolen generation, racism, intergenerational trauma, and suffering. By the end of each conference, all attendees understood and agreed upon the voice being a stepping stone into many other major goals. The most salient themes and goals being treaty and reparations and political power. The theme of political power involved getting people into local, state and federal politics with designated seats, or, quote, to have their own governments at local and state levels, end quote. Suggestions included a black-only parliament, which is paid for with reparations, or a black-only political party and a black constitution or an Aboriginal constitution, all designed and run by Aboriginal people only, people with Aboriginal heritage. Quotes include, "We need to be looking at our own parliament. We need a black parliament. We have got to have our own government." This is all linked to a phrase called self-determination that comes out of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which delegates referred to often. Self-determination includes creating and controlling other institutions as well, and lots of reparations, also known as makarata, also known as agreement making, also known as treaty. These quotes express some more sentiment around these ideas. Why haven't we got a political party? When are we going to say, we're going to tell you how things are going to happen? We'll tell them what our rights are and what we want. Our song men and song women need to sit above everything. We need to get black faces in Parliament so that our mob in Parliament can fight for us and so we can get what we want through Parliament. Also, the idea of a First Australians Party so Aboriginal people can fight together. There was discussion about abolishing existing state and local governments and creating regional administrative units based on cultural boundaries. Quote, that way each nation is naturally in the thoughts of governments in those areas, end quote. Another idea for power was to build on or incorporate existing regional and local decision-making bodies. There would also be a head of power, but this was not fully agreed upon across the dialogues. Despite quite a number of Aboriginal politicians around, there were comments about not having Aboriginal voices in Parliament. The Aboriginal politicians in power are apparently imposters and don't represent Aboriginal people. The sentiment, quote, for 200 years, we've had no political representation in this country, and our people can run for Parliament, but we can't get them in. Constitution. There was, of course, a lot of ideas about changing the Constitution. Various delegates wanted a completely new Constitution. Quote, why aren't we looking at dissolving the Constitution? Let's make our own Constitution, the Yolngu Constitution. There were conversations about how to rectify the Constitution with existing Aboriginal constitutions because, quote, prior to white men coming, there were 260 unwritten constitutions. It would have to acknowledge the Churkoba, our own constitution. It was expressed that traditional law should sit above constitution. Quote, our traditional laws, Altieri, Jurkupa and Turkupa, are strong and should sit above the constitution. The sentiment shines through as, quote, one participant made reference to the Australian Constitution being a colonial relic. Quote, we need to be able to thread ourselves through the Constitution. We've been too much pushed around by their constitution. Another quote, that constitution we have in our bags, it's a dud. It's not meant for black people, end quote. Aboriginal culture has the, quote, oldest governance structure on the planet, end quote. Another idea expressed was that, quote, we Aboriginals are not citizens. We are currently not recognised in the constitution, end quote. Either way, all ideas expressed were about treaty. Quote, get constitutional reform first, then talk about sovereignty and treaty, end quote. New states and territories. Delegates in various dialogues wanted to create their own states or territories and prosper from having the power of state governments. We hear about the creation of a new pan-Aboriginal state and an elected assembly with its own constitution. Also, a defined territory made up of Aboriginal-owned or native title lands, which could lead to representation at the United Nations. And then states and territories formed would have seats in the House of Reps and in the Senate. For example, the Torres Strait region could be its own territory. Jervis Bay could also be its own territory. Treaty. Treaty was perhaps the most pervasive theme throughout. Agreements with all three tiers of government, local, state and federal. This stood out to me and is a direct quote from the Hobart Dialogue. There was agreement that a treaty proposal must be discussed at regional dialogues, included in the final report from the Referendum Council and put into legislation, but not included in a referendum proposal. Treaties are seen as a way to increase political power and authority. There are sovereign treaties, treaty commissions, a treaty council, and all kinds of treaties. Treaties among Aboriginal tribes, and then a treaty with every single First Nations down the track. Lots of discussion about whether to pursue treaties first, along with constitutional change, or afterwards. A notable quote, recognition in the Constitution will give us more authority, more clout to negotiate a treaty. End quote. Any treaty negotiating framework developed in the future needs to be enshrined in the Constitution. In regards to some wanting to throw out the Constitution entirely, others retorted saying constitutional change will lead to treaty or a Bill of Rights. And there was a suggestion of a system of confederated local treaties across the regions. The sentiment was that treaty will solve this country's human rights issue. A treaty will include all the human rights we don't have here. Legal stuff. Another legal theme was being able to veto any laws that would not be wanted by Aboriginal people because they may negatively impact Aboriginal people. The power to veto popped up several times and also an ability for lobbying. It was suggested to also have lawmaking power, a First Nations Parliament with power to draft legislation to take to the Australian Parliament. Aboriginal lawyers would have input on High Court decision-making on Aboriginal cases, with lawyers being able to sit next to High Court judges. ATSIC was mentioned a bunch of times. The voice needs to be like ATSIC, but not to be taken away this time. We may remember that ATSIC was abolished for nefarious reasons, i.e. corruption. There would be a wanting or a need for international human rights lawyers and other successful international agencies which would be paid for by reparations. Reparations and funding was a big one throughout. Funding for the body and programs and such should be linked to reparations for theft of land. There was a fair bit of talk about taking control over funding that goes to various places, including control of the billions and billions that are spent each year on Aboriginal affairs. Some quotes, it needs to go directly into the hands of Aboriginal people, and I'd like to see all the money to set up the industry called Aboriginal Affairs captured for us. The idea of sovereign debt was raised to pay for the debts of dispossession and colonialism. There were comments about the campaign to pay the rent. If we talk about pay the rent, how about all these multinational corporations start to give us 1%, 2%, 5%. It's about time they started paying the rent. Or how about an open checkbook so we can take back our children? Another quote, we don't have access to our own seas as well. Treaty must include land and sea rights, a fixed percentage of gross national product, rates, land taxes, royalties, rights to self-determination, a timeline to achieve everything, and Aboriginal control. There are also water rights, subsurface rights, airspace rights, and allodial titles treaties. Other suggestions included securing economic independence through land tax, tariffs, or other forms of monies levied from people going on to country. In regards to housing, rent to buy schemes would be for Aboriginal people only, and relief from land taxes as well. And an independent Aboriginal community-controlled housing peak body would oversee certain things. And all services need to be free as a way of not paying the rent on their own land. The sentiment was that treaty would include reparations for past wrongs. Reparations and compensations will re-empower people. A treaty would provide reparations for past criminal acts and compensation for present and future criminal acts. And the various treaties that would arise don't cancel out existing agreements and benefits already in place. The sentiment about reparations is as follows, some quotes. Australia got a whole country for nothing. They haven't even begun to pay for it. And non-Aboriginal Australians must accept that they stand on the land of Aboriginals. And I want to see compensation. Aboriginal people should not have to fight for funding. And I want our people to be the billionaires and not the beggars on the land. Finally, we don't want your crumbs when we own the cake. Another theme was agreement making. This basically means treaty and reparations and is the literal translation of the word Makarrata. There would need to be trilateral agreements, an agreement-making commission, and the sentiment of this body being the body could help with the fight pushing for whatever we want to get. Agreement-making should be in the Constitution, and treaty and Makarrata are certainly in the Uluru Statement that everyone is about to vote on, but haven't seen. Another theme was education, or perhaps re-education. Aboriginal history needs to be compulsory and a core subject in school curriculums. Some common sentiment being that, quote, if massacres and the wars, theft of land, stolen generation were taught in schools, we might have a one nation where we are all together, and healing can only begin when this true history is taught. Teaching constitutional recognition in universities, schools and teachers' colleges was also mentioned. Australians would need cultural training. Quote, they see us as disadvantaged, but the white people are more disadvantaged because they live in a country that is not their own. They're living a lie. Acknowledgement. Acknowledgement of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders in the Constitution on its own was constantly dismissed. Quote, acknowledgement is not enough or indeed nothing. However, a declaration that says Aboriginal people have been here since the time of creation was put forward and favoured at one dialogue. Quoting from a summary dialogue, acknowledging that the British were not colonisers but they were invaders, murderers and rapists was offered and favoured as a suggestion. There was a suggestion to acknowledge the illegality of everything done since colonisation, which sets up means for reparations and other things in the roadmap models, including the Makarrata. Then there were a whole bunch of other things, and this is them. The Australian flag. Quote, it's time to change the flag too. There was a want to change the Union Jack to the Aboriginal flag. One meeting spoke about the important symbolism of the flag and how the Australian flag symbolised the injustice of colonisation. Similar sentiment included, quote, I want to see us continue the decolonisation of Australia. End quote. People said there is a lot of unfinished business in Australia. Unfinished business with a capital U and a capital B is indeed in the Uluru Statement. Quite vague and quite broad. There was some stuff about statue removal and having Aboriginal names for things across Australia. That white people cause division and Aboriginal people need to become united to get power. They need to be a collective. Quote, government fears us coming together as a people. One delegate raised the possibility that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people need to make this a bigger movement around race. There was a suggested strategy to engage with other minority communities to garner support. There are apparently continued attempts to, quote, breed Aboriginality out of people, end quote. Another one, we need to stop the white government conquering and dividing our people and our families, end quote. At one dialogue, it was mentioned that the classification as Aboriginal is a form of oppression by a white man and represents ongoing colonisation. But then the majority of delegates at a different dialogue said they found the word Indigenous offensive and that they were Aboriginal people. An interesting idea was to challenge the legality of colonisation, perhaps through class action, and that, quote, reconciliation is a waste of time and money. Another quote, we are not part of multiculturalism, we are the First Nations, end quote. Apparently the solution is not in their Bible. There was a want to mobilise younger people into activists and warriors. Quote, we need more money pumped into programs, culturally based only, to help our young men and young women to regain their status as warriors. That's out of Brisbane. Attendees at each dialogue were presented with roadmap models of how the voice would work. Establishing the voice is only part of the big picture, but is a milestone in the models. The roadmap models basically have the Makarrata Commission as an end goal. It will have a national framework that makes agreements with First Nations voice and Parliament, and then have substantive nation-by-nation agreements with First Nations and government. It's a big one. The agreements are, of course, all the things mentioned prior. Land rights, airspace rights, subsurface rights, water rights, sea or ocean rights, tariffs for going on country, percentage of GDP, taxes, relief from taxes, all kinds of authorities and commissions and groups paid for with reparations. Existing beneficial agreements remain, billions and billions of existing dollars being maintained but handed directly to certain Aboriginal people. The creation of new states and territories, the creation of a black parliament, Aboriginal-only politicians, designated seats and possible Aboriginal-only political parties, veto rights, law-making rights, race-based laws, representation at the United Nations, treaties, hundreds of treaties, and an open-ended ability to introduce many and more unknown things down the track, and no ability to stop this all once it's voted on. All of this was boiled down to make the 26-page Uluru Statement from the heart, and then the one-page statement, which will be the next video. There are Aboriginal people right across Australia who have taken to social media to say they are voting no. It might also be an appropriate time to mention that one of the Aboriginal co-authors of The Voice thanked his communist advisors for helping them write this all up. Interestingly, all communist, socialist and Fabian social networks support The Voice, treaty, reparations wholeheartedly. I'm sure that's just a coincidence. Hope that helped. See you in the next one. Peace.